So is my screen coming through okay? You see everything all right?
Yes, it looks wonderful.
Okay. Yeah. Great. Excellent. Alrighty. If we're all set, I'll get started here. So, really appreciate you inviting me to talk tonight. I was telling Stephanie earlier today that it's been a while since I've had an opportunity to talk to people about this project. In fact, the last time was at the Channel Islands 40th anniversary event we had back in February. And then it was just a few weeks later that we had the lockdown. And so it's a really great opportunity here to talk to you folks tonight. And I've been really anxious to really start reaching out to some of the gem and mineral clubs and societies around. So I really appreciate you having me tonight. So before I jump into talking about Serenians and sea cows, I just want to briefly talk about Tom Dibley. So my position at the museum, I've been here just over 3 years now. I'm the Dibley Curator of Earth Science, and the position is named for Tom Dibley, and I'm sure a lot of you folks are familiar with Tom and his work. He was just the ultimate geologic mapper. And he was really a pioneer in geologic mapping in California. And fortunately, a foundation was started years back to make sure Tom's maps were available and published. And then the Dibley Foundation eventually merged with the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. And Tom actually left his estate in order to start up an endowment to fund an earth science program at the museum. And so I just want to always make mention of Tom and just his amazing work. And if you're ever interested in a geologic map, we do have them for sale at the geology store. I've got that address down there. So I always like to start off a talk with an outline just to give you an idea of where we're going. We'll first talk about what a sea cow is, because it's really weird, and then we'll figure out how it actually got on to Santa Rosa Island, which means really talk about the geology, and then what went into excavating this specimen that we've been working on, and the research that's currently going on, even while things have kind of slowed down. So to start off, what are Serenians? And one answer is they're the subject of these really fantastic memes that you've seen floating around the internet. And you know, the basic answer here is these are marine mammals. So you can think of them to some degree being in the same group, at least ecologically, as whales and pinnipeds, so sea lions and otters and walrus, sea lions and walruses, excuse me. But it's a very distinct group. In fact, the closest modern relative to dugongs and manatees today is actually the elephant. So it's a very distinct group from the rest of the marine mammals. Something else that's really neat about sea cows is that they're the only modern herbivorous marine mammals. All the others are predators, or even if we're thinking the baleen whales, right? They're filtering out krill, but those are other animals that they're eating. Whereas the manatee and dugong are mostly munching on plants. There are some exceptions where some of these river environments that we found crustaceans in their diet. So they will have a little bit of seafood from time to time, but mostly they're herbivorous. And this really stands out in modern context. When you look at these two pictures of the manatee and dugong, these modern representatives, you can see some subtle differences. Probably most striking is in the tail. The manatee has this kind of beaver-like paddle tail, whereas the dugong has more of that classic kind of whale tail. There are also differences in their flippers. Manatees actually have little nails on their flippers, and there are some subtle differences.
We lost you sound-wise, Jonathan.
This now. So,
okay, we got you.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Let me know if you lose me again.
I will.
So there's also a difference in the deflection of the snout. It's a little more pronounced in the dugongs. This is a map of the geographic distribution of manatees and dugongs, and it also gives you a little sense of the modern taxonomy. There are only 3 species of sirenians or sea cows today, and they're in 2 different families, so they're actually pretty distinct. The family Trichichidae are the manatees, which are composed of 3 different species, although one of those is split into subspecies, the West Indian manatee. And then there's only one representative for family Dugongidae, and that is the dugong. That's the common name. And then the genus species binomial name is dugong dugong. So you'll never get that one wrong if you just say dugong. And it's real distinct when you look at this map and the color coding. The dugongids are really in the Eastern Hemisphere. If you see that orange line, it really traces the eastern coast of Africa all the way through the Middle East, coming down through Indonesia, and then onto the northern shores of Australia. Whereas the different species of manatees are all on the opposite other side of Africa and heading west. And you can see also that they're not just restricted to coastlines. Where they're definitely all over the place for coastlines, they will go upriver as well. And so you've got the Amazonian manatee in pink represented there in South America, as well as the West African manatee that'll go up some of the rivers in West Africa. So a really distinct separation geographically for these different species. There's really no niche separation or overlap. And I'll bring that up in a little bit on why that really stands out. Their evolution is somewhat similar to whales in that they started with a fully terrestrial ancestor, and then over time became better and better adapted for a fully marine environment and habit. And in the case of sirenians, we really go back about 50 million years ago. That's part of the reason they're so distant in terms of if you're looking at the family, or not family, but evolutionary tree of all these different mammals. They're really distant from the other marine mammals because they broke off so early. This is an example of one of the earliest known sirenians. This is called Pesosiren portelli, and it's actually from the Bahamas. And this is really great illustration, little movie in the upper right-hand corner of the skull. So this has been 3D scanned at University of Wyoming, which is actually my alma mater where I did my PhD work. And Mark Clements there, who I'll bring up a little bit, he does a lot of work on the early evolution of these animals and what they were eating and how quickly they got into the water. One of the things that should jump out with this skull, if you're thinking comparing it to other terrestrial animals, is as it kind of spins back around, so it's facing us here in a moment, you'll notice that the nasal cavity is really pushed back on its face, really high up. And so that nasal cavity is already kind of moving up for a marine habit. Another thing that really jumps out, if you look at the diagram of the skeleton, the ribs look pretty robust, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment, but that really relates to essentially adapting ballast to help weigh them down in the water. And so this animal would have been about pig size, but already kind of getting some of these marine adaptations. It probably spent a good amount of time in water, but was still coming out on land to do various things, probably things like feeding and breeding. This is another early sirenian. This one's from Spain, and it's around the same time period. It's already getting a lot of those robust ribs for adaptations, as well as that sinus cavity, nasal sinus that's being pushed farther back on the head, up the head. That's another adaptation for this marine lifestyle. And it should be noted too that these critters, as they first start swimming, their tails actually move like otters. So they're getting that kind of undulating motion. So this is actually a shot of some of the ribs that we recovered from Santa Rosa Island. And what I like about this shot is it really demonstrates this concept of pachyosteosclerosis. So it's a really big word, but it breaks down into basically meaning thick, robust bones. Osteo, of course, being bone. Pachy means thick, like if you think pachyderm is thick skin. And then sclerosis is essentially the opposite of porosis. If you think of osteoporosis being a loss of density, sclerosis is an addition of density. So these fat, dense bones. And what they essentially served in terms of functionality is as weights to help weigh these animals down as they start spending more and more time in the water and trying to take advantage of the plants that are on the substrate of some of these shallow seas. They still have a tendency to float if it weren't for these diving weights, essentially. And when it comes to floating, they've got a lot of air in these big lungs, and given their
Jonathan, we again lost you after the air and the big lungs.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, and I just got a little box pop up on my feed saying you may be experiencing network difficulties. So yeah, keep letting me know if you have any issues or if I'm having issues. Thank you. So when this animal's lungs are full of air, it's going to float. As it digests food, it's also creating a lot of gas, a lot of methane, so that will cause it to float as well. So it has these adaptations like these thick bones to help weigh it down. Also, interesting enough, modern sea cows, modern sirenians, manatees, and dugongs have really thick skin. It's not blubber, but it's a thick skin that has negative buoyancy. So it's another thing that helps weigh them down, this thick skin and these really thick, enlarged bones like the ribs. So those are some of the features that we're seeing on these early sea cows. This is a really wonderful image from a paper on sea cow evolution a few years back. And I brought up earlier that when you look at the map of their geographic distribution, what's really striking is it's very segregated. There's really no overlap in terms of range between these different species. And that really stands out compared to the rest of their evolutionary history. At various time periods in various parts of the world, we would see multiple species of sirenians coexisting and actually doing niche partitioning. When you start looking at their diets, able to figure out that some of them were feeding on the seafloor substrate, like you can see in the picture here, while others were feeding higher up in the water column. So what we have today is something that we see that's pretty widespread for the entirety of marine mammal evolution, which is diversity for these animals has really decreased over the last 10 to 15 million years. Okay, so that brings us to Santa Rosa finally. And the idea of how the heck these sea cows got there, and in particular on the top of near the highest points of the island. This is a great video that the Park Service has on their site, and it was made by Tanya Atwater at UC Santa Barbara, who of course has done a groundbreaking work with paleomagnetism and figuring out that what our geologic history is here. And as you're seeing now, you can see where the islands are located right here, breaking off about 20 to 18 million years ago. And so this is a detachment from the North American plate, and this has to do with the subduction of a triple junction spreading ridge. And this caused a lot of disruption. The chunk of kind of east-west, what's now east-west trending California, the Central Coast, broke off, caught a ride with the Pacific plate heading northwest. And then in the last 5 million years, slammed back into North America, and that caused uplift, creating the transverse mountain ranges running east and west, as well as at the same time uplifting the Channel Islands. And why that's relevant for us is that that means along between 5 and 20 million years ago, you have marine sediments that were being deposited that would later be uplifted. So this is a Dibley geologic map of Santa Rosa Island. And if you look at the top where the light parts are, those are the Pleistocene alluvium marine terraces that are best known for producing the pygmy mammoths and Columbian mammoths that we're so familiar with. And then as you get towards the center of the island, these brown areas here, those are those older marine sediments where we're finding things like sea cows. So if we look at a quick little strat column of the island, and we're going to zoom in just on the last 30-ish million years, we find that the sea cows coming out of a layer that we initially were thinking was Vaqueros Formation. That's being debated right now. In contrast, the pygmy mammoth and Columbian mammoths are coming out of those surficial sediments. So there's a big time gap here. And initially, we were thinking that maybe the age of our sea cow locality is around 23 million years old. We've been revising that, and I'll go into a little more detail in a moment on that. But it's pretty striking to have these very different time periods, different habitats represented on the same island. And these are also closely related animals when you look at their evolutionary history. So it's pretty wild to think that there were mammoths roaming around Santa Rosa Island at one point, while there were sea cow fossils weathering out of those rocks on the interior of the island. So for those rocks on the interior of the island, the only reason we know about the sea cow is we had some geologists who were out there doing a mapping project, kind of updating the work of Tom Dibley and others. And these gentlemen work for the U.S. Geological Survey, and they were interested in faults. And they were trying to put together the geologic history of the island, particularly with the faulting. And they came across some bones. And what I've marked here in this image is this black line. You can kind of just make out some of a fault scarp. And while they were tracing this fault, they came across some bleached ribs of a sea cow. That led to a group of us coming out to check out the site. We quickly mobilized to get everything protected because this was the end of summer 2018. And we knew with the wet season coming up, there's a strong chance that the specimen wouldn't survive. One thing I want to point out, if you look at this blue line, I'm highlighting the stratum that produced the sea cow. This dashed blue line is the same stratum. It detached, it slumped off due to the fault action running right next to it. And that gentleman sitting right there, he is actually excavating the skull of the specimen while these other two students are working on the skeleton. So in effect, this specimen, it had kind of been decapitated kind of twice, actually. Once after the animal had died and been deposited on the substrate, and it looks like the head had gone scattered across away a few feet, and then a second time later, much later, by that fault action. So this is a shot of the ribs that were spotted. And got to give a lot of credit to the USGS scientists and their interns who spotted this. And it was actually an intern who spotted, this is the skull. So that little ridge that's sticking out there, that's part of the very top of the skull. And then this is the very back of it. So very eagle-eyed geologists were out there that day, thankfully. And to give you an idea of what we did while we were out there, we were mostly concerned with stabilizing it, meaning we want to cover any bone that's exposed. We want to cover it in a consolidant that'll help hold it together. Beyond that, we also want to cover it in plaster. And so the first thing we have to do is kind of determine the boundaries of the specimen. So we kind of dig a trench around it to establish that perimeter. Every time we come across another bone, we're going to widen that trench out a little bit because we want to try and take it out in one big block. What we end up having an issue with, though, is that right here, there is a bridge of bone that keeps going into the hillside. And so this unit is a conglomerate. And it looks, our early interpretation is that this is probably a river channel feeding out into the near shore environment. And we know from modern sea cows that they will swim upriver. So it looks like this animal had essentially died in a estuarine environment. And at some point, the bones started getting scattered, and we think it might even have been the paleo direction of the currents that the rib scatter has aligned with. So after we've kind of defined the perimeter for this critter, let's see if my video is going to freeze on me. We start covering it in toilet paper, and the reason we're doing this is we want to create a separation layer, because we're about to add a bunch of plaster, and when we go to remove that plaster in the lab, we don't want it sticking to any of the rock or any of the fossil, because when you go to tear that off, you might end up destroying the specimen. So this is just a time-lapsed sequence of us adding first the toilet paper, and then we end up adding the plaster by using these medical bandages that are already covered in gypsum, getting them wet. And then we followed up with a few more layers, this time using the more traditional burlap, making our own plaster Paris mixture and soaking those strips of burlap and applying those. So this is just more of that process. And this is the actual real time. It's a very slow process. We'll have to serve it correctly. Okay. While we were out there, we were also collecting other material besides just the one specimen. It turns out there were a lot of sea cow fossils in the ravine we were working at. And this is a really fantastic shot that was taken when we had a photographer from the VC Star out there with us. We had found a 200-pound block of sea cow ribs, and we really wanted to get it out that day. And so the Park Service was great. They helped us get a emergency litter to load this specimen out, and then I think it was 6 or 7 of us took turns rotating out, getting up a very steep hill and out of that area. So that was summer 2017. I said 2018 earlier. So we came back a year later in August of 2018, and what you see there is a lot of gray peeking through. That's the weathering damage that was done to the plaster jacket in the roughly, let's see, actually it was about 10 months because we were out there last in November of 2017. So we were really pretty excited to see this. The big thing being this was justification for getting out there in the first place and protecting the specimen. We didn't get a lot of rain that summer, as you might remember. So most of that damage is actually from the wind. And what's essentially happening is the wind is picking up all the loose sand nearby and just sandblasting that jacket. So we were really, really happy that we'd gone out there and protected the specimen so we didn't lose it to erosion. This is just a picture of the skull, a little kind of jacket nut. And this is a picture of a grad student at UC Santa Barbara, Chris Everett, who had worked on that specimen from the outset, both the 2017 and 2018 seasons. And then we finally flipped the entire skeletal jacket towards the end of this trip. And after we'd flipped it, the Park Service helped us build a crate, load it onto a cargo net, and then it was helicoptered out a month or so later. So after it caught a boat back to the Channel Islands headquarters, it was unloaded off the boat and then headed back up to the museum for preparation and study. So that finally brings me to just a quick talk about what we're doing now. And so we really want to tackle kind of 2 big questions, and then there are a couple more detailed questions within those. The first big question is, when did Sirenians arrive on the West Coast? I didn't really go into how they spread out in their evolutionary history, but you might recall I mentioned there was a specimen going way back 50 million years ago found in Spain, but then they also got across the Atlantic pretty quickly, and there was that Bahamian specimen just a few million years younger. So we have a lot of questions on how sea cows got spread out from North Africa, or Northern Atlantic, excuse me, area where we're finding fossils in Europe and Northern Africa, to quickly moving across the Atlantic. And then as we go across the southern coast of North America, keep in mind that the Americas hadn't connected. So there was at some point the sea cows came around and then up the west coast. And it's been hypothesized that that kind of arrival to the west coast and then swinging upward might have happened around 25 million years ago. And the reason we think this is the oldest known sea cow fossil on the west coast is up in Oregon, and it's about 23 million years old. So we were really excited thinking this could be around 23 million, maybe even a little bit older. This could be that first arrival on the west coast. And what we're doing is we got to first figure out, well, how old is that sea cow site on Santa Rosa Island? And then how is this particular taxon, this species, related to other Sirenians? And so that gets into, is this a new species? And we're working with Dr. Jorge Velez Parbe at LA County Museum of Natural History. And Jorge is an expert on sea cow evolution. And so he's been studying the skull. He was actually up at the museum last December and taking measurements to see how it compares to some of the other sea cows he's been studying. And the final results haven't been decided yet, but the early thoughts were that this does seem to be a distinct species, probably not a distinct genus, but it is looking to be probably a distinct species. So we're kind of keeping our fingers crossed that those interpretations will hold, because it'd be really nice to have a species unique to the Channel Islands. And then that other big question, what was driving that distribution? So if we're figuring out when they arrived to the west coast, what was it that they were chasing? And there's this idea that sea cows are highly preferential to eating seagrass. And seagrass doesn't really leave fossils very well, so we don't have a great record of that. But it's been proposed you could actually use sea cow fossils as a proxy for the distribution and the spread of seagrasses. And so that starts getting into questions like, well, what was the environment like? What was the ecology like? Is this part of a bigger picture in terms of global climate and positioning of the continents? Kind of these big picture questions like that. And so one of the big things we're doing right now to help answer those questions is study the invertebrates. I'm working with a recently graduated student from UC Santa Barbara on identifying all the different fossil shells from the sea cow site, and then using those to try and figure out biostratigraphically what the age of that layer is. And we're working with, in conjunction with US Geological Survey, sampling some of those shells for strontium dates, using radiometric dating to get absolute dates to really figure out where we're at. Because right now, it's pretty unclear. Originally, we were thinking about 23 MA. Then some of the taxa we've been finding are more suggestive of a much younger age, maybe in the 15 to 10 million range. So we're actually waiting right now with bated breath. I'm hoping in the next 2 weeks we'll get some results back from the USGS labs in Denver, because we just sent some specimens off for analysis. And then the other big thing we're looking at is the skull itself. So this is, up top is the sea cow skull that's been prepped out. So the cradle's still there to help support it, but otherwise we've actually removed the whole thing, as well as removed the rock to expose the bone. And the kind of reddish brown areas, chocolate brown, that's the bone itself. And then the light gray areas are where we've left some of that conglomeratic rock in place. The reason being that as you remove more and more rock, you're destabilizing that fossil. And so we've left some of that rock in there to buttress it because it's so fragile. And in fact, the whole skull has been compressed, because remember, this was right up against that fault line. And so there was a lot of pressure on that, and it's fairly distorted. It's kind of been sheared actually on the opposite side that of what we're looking at. Down below, that's a modern West Indian manatee skull that we have in the collections at SBM&H, and I've just put that skull in the same positioning as our fossil skull. So we're looking on the palate, the roof of the mouth here. So it's kind of leaning towards the top of the head. And that's where Dr. Velez-Warbe is looking at these different features, correcting for some of this distortion, and trying to figure out how this animal is related to other sea cows. That's just another look here where you can actually see, the zygomatic arch, which is the cheekbone, and this would be the eye orbit right here. And I'll just throw in one last bit. When we were leaving Channel Islands that first time out in November into December of 2017, the morning we left looked a lot like this. It was very smoky. The Thomas fire had broken out the night before. So we were very fortunate to get off the island, get back to the mainland, because of course, Park Service personnel, all of them were really anxious to get back to their families and their homes, and they couldn't leave a bunch of paleontologists out there on their own. So we caught a ride with Channel Islands Aviation and the park, and these are a couple of the students from, one's from UC Santa Barbara and these others from Santa Barbara City College. They were having a great time. They loved getting in that little plane. I was meanwhile really terrified that my first project was gonna go down in the channel. But we made it home safely, even if it did take most of the day. So just to wrap up here, I want to give a lot of credit to all the different people involved in the project and the 2 different field seasons. We had folks from, I believe it was 8 different institutions, including Santa Barbara City College, UC Santa Barbara, my old advisor at University of Wyoming in the lower right-hand corner here, Dr. Mark Clements, as well as a lot of help from the Park Service, both staff and volunteers. And we just had really fantastic people. And with that, just more kind of giving shout outs there. I'll take any questions you have.
Oh. Does anyone have a question for Jonathan? Let's see. View everyone.
So, when COVID ends, is it possible for civilian personnel to get involved in digs like this?
So right now, I've put all my island fieldwork on hold. We partner with the park to do this work, and actually I was talking just before we began, where we're socializing, that we're in the midst of trying to establish a resource management program in collaboration with the park and some of the other institutions in our area. That program was really supposed to get off the ground this summer, and so that took a hit for certain. And right now, I've suspended all my fieldwork out on the islands because unfortunately, it's really difficult to try and control transmission when most of my volunteers are spread out throughout the state because their college students have gone home. So it'd be bringing these vectors from all in. We get on the boat, and then the real kicker is we stay in park housing, and we could kind of distance that way, but at the end of the day, we have to spend, you know, anywhere from 1 to 3, maybe 4 hours in a pickup truck together. And so you have to keep the windows up. It's policy because of all the dust on the island. It just wasn't feasible to put together the size of crew I like to take out there, 4 or 5 people, where we can really cover a lot of ground and get a good amount of work done. I've been kind of teasing around with the idea of going out there with just another person if we can take some precautions beforehand in terms of getting tested and quarantining. But right now, I've just kind of put everything on hold. my best case scenario I'm thinking is as vaccines become more widely available, that we could potentially get back out there with an actual decent sized crew next summer. So right now I'm in the midst of planning field work for 2021 in the hopes that we'll be able to pull that off. And if things aren't to that point yet in terms of vaccine distribution, then the other thing I'm looking at is, will it be possible to just do this type of work in much smaller groups where I don't have to worry about potentially getting other people sick?
I will look forward to that whenever we get vaccines and COVID ends. This has been ridiculous.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely looking forward to all of your new activities and research. That sounds like a lot of fun.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yeah. And also let me throw out, if anyone's ever interested in learning more or getting involved, particularly as things reopen, if you're interested in volunteering, it could be field work or in our prep lab. Of course, everything's been shut down right now, but we get a lot of folks involved in fossil preparation, and that's always a wonderful thing to have people help us out with. So if anyone's interested, I'll put my email address in the chat here, and feel free to send me an email. And once we've reopened again, I really like giving tours to folks of our collection. So part of it is kids who bring in a fossil they want identified, and it's usually a rock, and I don't have the heart to just send them away disappointed. So we'll take them back into the collection range and show them fossils. And really the bigger thing is, these are federal property, they're public property to some extent. And since the taxpayers help support this collection, we're really big on facilitating visitation and being able to show things off. I do say I like to always get a heads up if we can schedule an appointment. That's preferable. So I'm not caught in a meeting or anything like that. But I'll actually type in the chat right now my email address, and always feel free to shoot me an email. Okay, here we go. Yeah, and just on that point of not wanting to spread transmission or not wanting to transmit anything, my very first week out to the islands of doing this dig, on the third day, I came down with an incredible cold where we got rained out that day, thankfully, so we didn't go out in the field. We went home for Thanksgiving, came back the following week, and I had learned that my cold had spread through the Park Springs.
Oh, geez.
So after that experience, I swore I would never be a typhoid Mary again. And during the pandemic, that's doubly true.
Thank you for holding back for our sake, and everyone's sakes. No, I completely agree. Something similar happened to me when I was younger, and yeah, I actively avoid being around anyone when I'm sick.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't realize I was sick until I was stuck on an island, unfortunately. But yeah, it's always a really good idea to stay home when you're feeling ill, even if it's a cold.
Jonathan, on a totally different thing, I know you're focused on sea life and sea fossils, but the islands are home of a pygmy mammoth, and there was the Moore Park mammoth that's now residing in Santa Barbara. Have you seen any evidence of any other mammoths or any mammals, fossils in your, I don't know, surveys?
Great question. So we've come across a lot of mammoth material. It is really all over the northern parts of the island. And so in kind of the lead up to this inventory report that was published earlier this year, I'd been going out and doing some surveying, in particular with the retired archaeologists from the Channel Islands. So Don Morris, who was the archaeologist from 1980 to 1999, he had gotten really interested in pygmy mammoths, and he worked with Larry Agenbrod, who was a mammoth expert based out of South Dakota at the mammoth site. And so that's how mammoth site originally got involved. Was Larry was coming out to the islands in the 1990s at the request of this archaeologist to say, hey, apparently we've got these mammoths that I knew had been found back in the 1800s, but I thought we found them all. And what can you tell us? And so Larry and Don Morris started looking all over the place, and it was kind of a bonanza of mammoth fossils. And they really just kind of are all over. Outside of the mammoths, there are some things like we do have subfossil records of some stuff like the spotted skunk, as well as the fox. And we actually have a skull of a skunk that we're trying to determine the age of to see. It could be fairly old where it was found. Beyond that, if you look at some of the sites where mammoth remains have been found, like the most recent mammoth that came off of Santa Rosa in 2015, the Laramendi skull, there were things like frog bones that were found with. So getting, this was a real huge leap because what the mammoth site folks were doing was they were taking matrix samples and sieving the matrix and finding those microfossils that you're only going to find by doing that type of work. And so they just started finding all types of things, bird bones. In fact, not some of the most extensive fossil record we have right now on the islands is the bird record. When you go into some of these caves, like on San Miguel Island, the cave sediments are just chock full of birds. And so our curator of vertebrate zoology here, Paul Collins, he's been working on those animals for some time. And I think he's getting ready to actually publish a paper, and he's also been working on a book documenting all the known bird species from the islands over the last, I don't know how many thousands of years. So it's a really extensive record for the birds in particular. In terms of megafauna, though, it was really just the mammoths. And one of the things is they got out there, we think, by swimming. When you look at modern elephants, they're actually really good swimmers. In particular, there are these anecdotes of elephants swimming in the Indian Ocean, kind of island hopping. Going from Sri Lanka to some of these other smaller islands. One story I've heard that's really great is a bull went missing, and they found him on an island 30 miles away in a pen with a female. So if there's a strong enough desire, they will swim quite a ways. And what we think happened was, this would have been a time period, probably 200,000, 150,000 years ago, and would have been a low-level sea stand. So there's enough glaciation on the continent that sea levels had dropped. As that sea level is dropping, the coast of the islands is moving closer to the mainland. The coast of the mainland is moving closer to the islands. And you actually form one island at some point where the water has dropped below the land that connects all those islands. And so we had this super island called Santa Rosa that the mammoths were populating, at the very least, the perimeter of that. Of the periphery. It looks like they weren't able to scale very steep slopes, so they probably weren't getting into that interior as much. But other than those big mammoths that got out there probably for food, since there's so much competition on the mainland, we don't have any large mammals really until people start going out there. And that's how we think the fox, potentially the skunk, first appeared out there, either, and as well as some of the mice, either as purposely being brought out there. Like we think maybe the foxes were used as pest control, and some of those just as pests that got into the boats that were crossing the channel. So it's pretty unusual in that regard that there really is only the one terrestrial megafauna taxon out there. But it'll always be interesting if we find something else.
So you brought up the island fox. I just have to ask, are they interested in your digs?
Interested, I think, would be an overstatement. Maybe resentful. We would put a tarp over the dig site every day to protect it from the wind, and we would leave our tools out there because it was a really steep ravine. We didn't want to haul all these heavy tools every day, so I had a bucket where we had all the tools in, and you know, the first thing we learned was they'll get into everything and they'll strewn everything about. And then once we got it to where everything was really secure every night, well, they couldn't get into our stuff, so they just defecated and urinated all over everything just to remind us it's their territory. But yeah, we really didn't see them much other than the drive to the site and the drive back every morning. It's about 45-minute drive each way. And in the morning, we'd usually see one. And often, if we were driving back late enough, we'd usually see them in the late afternoon. And they were, you know, very unafraid of the big truck we're in. And we usually had to wait for them to get out of the way. And they took their time sometimes.
Sort of like cows in Australia or sheep, where you just have to wait for the herd.
Yeah. And you know, it's one of the things where researchers can get approved to drive Park Service trucks, and so I was very fortunate to get that approval. And before I got approved, I was getting driven around by a Fox technician, and she was conveying how she goes slower than most people. There's only a 15-mile-an-hour speed limit already, but she goes slower than most people because she doesn't want to be that Fox researcher who ran over a fox. So that kind of stuck with me, and I tend to go pretty slow because I don't want to be that researcher who ran over a fox either.
Well, does anyone else have any questions? Oh, look around. So, well, Jonathan, I think I'm going to thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I very much enjoyed it. I imagine everyone else did too. It'll be a conversation.
Oh, great. I'm really happy to have had the opportunity. Thank you for having me.